Hi, my name is Jayne Gordon, and I wanted to share with you my favorite quote, or one of them, from Henry Thoreau. And it's this it's from his essay, Life Without Principle. And he says, "Let us consider the way in which we spend our lives."
And hello, I'm Tammy Rose, and welcome to Concord Days. I'm very honored to have our illustrious guest, Jayne Gordon, here. Welcome, Jayne. Thank,
Thanks.
thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to bring her on because of her extensive experience with Concord and history and getting people to actually interact with history as well. And so I wanted to start our conversation sort of with a question. Jayne, did you ever expect that you were going to have a life that was sort of dedicated to Concord when you were like back in high school? Like what was your first impulse or encounter?
Yeah, actually, I guess in a way, I did. And my daughter likes to joke and say that I'm doing the same thing now in my 70s that I was doing in high school. And she's kind of right. So I'm either in a rut or I've got great continuity. I was actually I was actually a guide on Lexington Green doing historical tours of Lexington Green when I was in high school, and realizing, and you use the word interacting with history, and I think it's exactly that, just getting people all excited. I realized that you could get people really excited about history if you talked about like the dilemmas people faced and the choices they made, and the and just that their own, inconsistent, really fascinating, intriguing lives, mysterious lives. So that was happening. And at the same time, I had a high school boyfriend who loved Thoreau, and he used to take me to Walden Pond and read me excerpts from Thoreau. So yeah, so actually, I probably did know in high school I was going to be spending a lot of time with Henry Thoreau.
I love that. I love that. And especially like I love that you grasped onto the complexities of humans
Yeah.
throughout history, because I feel like a lot of history just sort of gets presented as a series of facts, and a lot of historical figures turn into stereotypes. Like Thoreau is this guy who just hates people and he only wants to live in a cabin by the, in the woods,
You
or
got it. You
yeah,
got it.
yeah. Or Louisa May Alcott is only writing for women, or something like that, where actually like they're much more complex and they do have dilemmas and, face all sorts of weird things. And I love that you were romanced by somebody at Walden.
Right. Who went off to Oberlin. And I think that you can identify with people from history better if you realize that they too didn't always know exactly what they were doing, that they too faced these real challenges and really tough decisions that they had to make in their lives. So that make, the more we can see that with students, with adults, I think the more then they become people who become much more interesting to us.
Exactly. And I think also decisions in their lives, because when Henry is or the transcendentals are introduced to people in high school, they're kind of like, oh, there's all this philosophy and nature and questioning authority and whatever.
Yeah.
And I think maybe America as a society is kind of like, you have to understand who you are like as soon as possible, so you can start, working hard on your career and sort of stay in one track. But
Right.
the older you grow, I feel like the more choices that become available to you, the more things you want to give up and start up, and and changes that you want to make. So I feel like their philosophy applies like throughout your life.
Absolutely. And not only does it apply throughout your life, but I think different aspects of what they have to say to you are different at different times in your life. I mean, like many people, I have my old copy of Walden from high school, and I have always been a person who underlined things that appeal to me or made stars or
Yeah.
little asterisks. And it's really interesting to see how the things change at different points in my life. Because in other words, any kind of relationship with an historical character, right? It's a two-way relationship. So you're changing, you're changing as you go through the different parts of your life. So you're meeting them in a different place, essentially.
Exactly. And it's fun that you say two-way relationship, because I agree that somehow they seem to change, and they seem to like have more dimension the more you get to know them. So the Thoreau that you encounter in high school is not necessarily the Thoreau you're going to meet when you're 40.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
And I definitely deal with the idea of spirits and like this other metaphysical sense of like, we think that things are dead or in the past, but things are, I feel like history is constantly commenting on the present.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I always think about, we always talk about the influence of the past on the present. And that's certainly true, but there's also the influence of the present on the past. In other words, who we are and the way we view things and the way we have lived our lives and our lived experience very definitely influences the way that we look at historical people and issues as well. So we just have to be really aware of that.
Exactly. So, and can we talk directly about your experience through Concord? I went to your like LinkedIn page and I was like, oh my God, she did this. And then she was this. And so it seemed like it was a consistent narrative, but I also feel like every piece was kind of like just building onto this whole idea of sharing history and these authors with the world. So can you maybe go through some of the highlights of your career?
Sure. And I think you really hit it. I think that one of the things when I was in college, I could never decide whether I wanted to be an English major or a history major. And so I guess I was pretty much American studies, right? And I was teaching high school. I taught high school history, but I was also working at Louisa May Alcott's house, the Alcott House, in the summers when I was teaching, and the director left. So the directorship was open, and I became director of Orchard House, and I was there for 16 years. So I lived at Orchard House, almost as long as the Alcotts did, and they were my other family. So I actually, it was a wonderful opportunity, in a sense, to look at Concord through the eyes of one family, and that kind of grounded it. So you're looking, and I remember, particularly with Louisa, where she would talk about that Emerson helped her to understand herself and nature and God more than anyone. And I thought, wow, here's someone who is not, sucking up Emerson because they have to in a college course, but because he is helping her to understand all those things about her life. And so I better give him another look. And so that, in a sense, got me looking at the others, and I love that. And so I was at Orchard House for 16 years, and then I was at the Concord Museum for another 8 years as the director of education. And that was wonderful because the main character was Concord, the town. Right. And so my big question was always the relationship of these writers and their town. What did the town mean to them in a physical sense? What was important about the town, and in a kind of social sense, their interactions with the individuals and the issues and the institutions. And then symbolically, what did Concord mean? What did it mean that this was a town associated with two revolutions? So that those years at the Concord Museum were really important, and I was involved in doing a major exhibition called Why Concord, that National Endowment for the Humanities funded, and it looked at why particular things happened in this place and not somewhere else. And then I worked as a kind of special what would you call it? Sort of advisor or specialist to Nancy Nelson when she was superintendent of Minuteman National Historical Park. So I worked for the park, and at the same time I was teaching courses at Tufts and supervising interns in the Graduate Museum Studies program for Tufts. And we were always looking at how schools and historic sites can work together, why it's important to visit the actual physical places.
And let me stop you there, because I can, like, growing up, I grew up in Waltham, 20 minutes away from Concord. Like, I feel like growing up in an area where you can actually go and like walk through the doors of these houses. Yes. Right. Yes. And walk along the same streets and understand that all these things are not, individual chapters in your textbook, but, real people, real places, and you get fascinated by the details.
Absolutely. And the question, I couldn't agree with you more. The question that I always ask is, what can you come to learn by being in these actual places, immersed in them, that you could never learn any other way, not by any other medium. And so that's been a really consistent thing for me, that sort of interweaving of the people, the history, the literature, the landscape, all how that all fits together, landscape and literature, how the literature helps you understand the landscape, and how being, in the landscape helps you to understand the literature. And it's all inseparable from the local history. So as you said at the beginning, I've worked in a lot of different sites in Concord, but there's been this kind of continual thread throughout it. So that's been really consistent. So I worked, and I was doing a lot of different consulting things, and then became director of the Thoreau Society. And I was at the Thoreau Society for 3 years as director there, and absolutely loved it. So it's a joy coming back and being on the board of directors, which I was way back and now have been for quite a while. So it's always my love, Thoreau Society.
Yeah, and then and the Thoreau Society is probably never going to let you go anyway, so they're going to always make sure that you're there for some some panels, to host something. So
and I, as you know, I love doing that. And then I was at the Massachusetts State Historical Society as the first director of education there for another 8 years before I retired. But I've come back after retirement. I've been doing workshops in Concord, and it gets back to something you just mentioned about bringing people to the actual places. The National Endowment for the Humanities has this workshop program, grant funded, that brings teachers, K-12 teachers, to actual places that have landmark status. And many of these are teachers, for example, who've taught Emerson and Thoreau their entire lives, but they've never had a chance to actually be in the places associated with them. So doing those workshops in Concord, where teachers come from all over the country for a week and actually get to be in the places and work with the scholars who can help to explain those places, it's wonderful. It's magical. So I love.
And what kind of secret do you teach the teachers, or do you have a special here's a technique that we use at the museum that's going to work really great in your classroom, or here's an example of one moment where I saw the light dawn on somebody, on a child's head, or something like that.
Right. Well, a lot of different ones, and I love exposing people to all these different scholars who have all these different ways of relating. But the last one we did on Thoreau was through the Concord Museum, and part of what we were really trying to teach as a skill, and the museum is really good at this, is visual literacy. In other words, we know how to read text, but we're not so good at reading visual things, whether it's actual elements of the landscape, or it's looking at images or photographs. What can those things tell us? So that's a really important part of it. But I think a lot of it, and with the Thoreau workshops we were doing, a lot of it is just taking Thoreau's really difficult questions, about how you live as a principled, ethical person in the natural world and in the social world, and how do you live with your own conscience, and really not coming up with necessarily answers, but helping the teachers to be able to work with students so they can begin to ask those questions themselves about their own lives, because it's not about Thoreau ultimately, right? It's about the students, the people who are interacting with Thoreau.
Yeah, but also his spirit of constantly questioning authority, Absolutely. Questioning existence, questioning your teachers, right? And to be able to teach that, as a teacher, to be able to give your students that kind of skill of analytic thinking, and to say, yes, this is how I'm presenting it to you, but go out into the world and find out for yourself. Come back.
Absolutely. And you're bringing that up, I think reminds me of something else, which is that with these workshops, the greatest scholars of transcendentalism, have been parts of these workshops. And what they're modeling, I mean, obviously they're incredibly knowledgeable, but they're also modeling being students. They are constantly searching themselves. They're constantly questioning. They are interacting with the teachers, because they're all teachers, they're all students, right? And so for teachers to be able to sit down with these scholars and kind of investigate together, and that I always frame things as an investigation. It's like a joint investigation, and we're learning together. So modeling that kind of passion, that kind of curiosity and openness for learning, that if I teach anything, it's probably, hopefully it's that.
Right. So yeah. Can I ask you kind of a difficult question, or I don't know if it's going to be difficult or not, because every time we had been talking about like annual gathering of the Thoreau Society, and there's a part of me that has this, or had this perception of academia as something where, people walk into a room and they're absolutely confident of what they're saying. And if you ask a question, they're going to turn it back on you and say, oh, well, obviously you haven't read, the basic texts or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Where academia is very intimidating. And lately I feel like sometimes the society has people who present that maybe have that opinion, and then a lot of them don't. And like, was it a different kind of mix sort of when you were first going to the annual gathering? Has it changed over the years, or has it always been kind of a mix?
That's a good question. I don't think it's changed, because I think the Thoreau attracts people from every walk of life. So, people who are interested in Thoreau, through the literary sense, through the, scientific sense, because he loved to camp and, canoe, because of his lifestyle, choices, just all the different, and certainly his social justice issues he brings up, all of that are important. So you're gonna, by the interdisciplinary nature of Thoreau, you're going to attract people just from a really diverse groups. And what I've noticed about the Thoreau Society, and I've been to plenty of all academic conferences in my life, and I don't work in the academy other than, when I was teaching at Tufts for a dozen years, as an adjunct. But what I love about the Thoreau Society is that you have people who are in the university, you have people who are out in the scientific fields, you have people who are just love Thoreau. And as long as the language is accessible, and people aren't using, the specific language to their discipline, that, the jargon words that the rest of us wouldn't understand, I think I've always seen that the interplay between the scholars and the maybe the lay people is always wonderful, because there's that shared enthusiasm. And maybe it's the culture of the Thoreau Society. I don't see that kind of snotty arrogance about, you don't have a doctorate, so you don't know anything. I've never seen that. What I see, and I love that, and that was evident, and I've been going to annual gatherings for God knows how many decades. I see like a real generosity where people just get excited about sharing, and seeing other people who are interested in Thoreau, and so that they're very generous with each other. They give each other credit. They they share with each other, and they're just genuinely happy that people are interested in the same thing. And I remember Joel Meyerson once said to me, don't forget that most of us are in our separate universities all over the world. We're not with a lot of other people who are interested in the transcendentalists. So when we all come together, it's wonderful, because we're with our tribe.
Exactly.
So that's a nice way of thinking about it. So I think that's what makes it so alive and vital, that it is not just one set group of people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I feel as if I've also come to it very late. I think I only started attending in 2013. And the rest of my life, earlier in my life, I've been going to Walden all the time, swimming there every my life, but never really going into the bookshop to really talk to people. I would only go in for like a specific book, but I wasn't tapped into the community.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you
Well,
think?
and it's an interesting, as you know, I mean, this is a worldwide community. So that's what's fascinating about it. And so the challenge becomes how to kind of keep this whole worldwide community of people feeling like one community linked together. And at the same time, having and so a lot of that has to happen in a way that doesn't prevent people who live geographically really far away from feeling part of it. And yet at the same time, there's also that, wanting to get everybody you can to Concord and just gather them all together in that place that's so special to all of us. So trying to honor both of those things, I think, is really important.
And I think it balances the tension out really well, because if you know that you're going to be with your tribe just for 5 days or something, then it really makes it special. But if you were to all live together in like a commune or like Fruitlands or something, I'm sure that we would all like get on each other's nerves and like that sort of thing. So there is something to be said to have your own cabin in the woods or your own place in Maine like you have. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we all need our kind of combination. It's some balance of society and solitude. So and getting together for those annual gatherings can be really intense, whether it's in person or online. So you almost need that opportunity to kind of back away and just absorb everything and process it.
exactly. And this year I'm very glad that they had everything online and it was recorded, so
Yes.
things can be accessible. And I think they're going to have it available for a couple of months. And
Yeah, I agree.
so it adds a whole other dimension of like, let's actually use the technology for some beneficial purposes, rather than just an extra step that we have to an extra thing that keeps us separate from each other.
Absolutely. And to me, that's also very Thoreauian. And you talked about, how people have all the stereotypes about Thoreau. It's like he hated technology. He was a Luddite. Well, that's not true. I mean, he was fascinated with all the new technologies of the train and the telegraph and all, but he carefully considered the implications, both good and bad, of those new technologies. And I think that's what we're doing. We're saying that, that this, given the circumstances of pandemic and all this new technology helped us to stay together as a community, and it will continue to help us to stay together as a community because we are so geographically dispersed. But at the same time, there are disadvantages to that, because it also keeps us separate if it prevents us from ever wanting to be physically in the same place, and prevents us, from being in the, understanding Thoreau by being in his hometown. So we just got to carefully weigh, all those factors.
Yeah. Well, and the theme of next year's annual gathering is global.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm really excited about the challenges that that's going to bring, because, how are you going to really create an authentic experience? And is it going to be online? Is this going to be made up of people who have to fly from all the different corners of the world to come to Concord? Exactly. Or, how do you make it truly global and accessible for everyone?
Absolutely. And there is a conference being planned as part of this in Iceland, as well as in Concord. In late May, Henrik Otterberg is working on planning that. So that actually, if you think about it, in the middle of the Atlantic, is bringing at least, from part of the world, scholars from two different directions together as well. So it should be quite exciting.
I would actually prefer to attend it in Iceland. Yeah.
I'm planning on it.
Yeah. No, that sounds so exciting. So as part of your educational experience and, helping to introduce people from, all over Massachusetts, and certainly I'm sure from much further on, what kind of advice do you have for teachers or people who work in museums, or people who are just starting to read Walden and want to get into it a little bit more? How what kind of advice would you give them?
That's interesting. I think I guess I would say that reading, maybe just kind of reading selections from Walden and selections from Civil Disobedience, and maybe selections from some of those essays like Life Without Principle and Walking, and just give you more of a little bit of an overview of Thoreau. I mean, I think different people are going to glom on to different aspects of Thoreau that they find fascinating. And one of the things that I've seen in the last 30, 40 years, that's a huge difference, is that Thoreau was pretty much the province of the English teachers, right? Of the literature professors. Right. And starting with, I think the work that Bradley Dean did back a couple of decades ago, looking at Thoreau as a scientist, as a real, in the field, hardcore scientist, really started to broaden out the different ways we look at Thoreau. And then people who are looking at all of his work in dealing with confronting the great issue of his time of enslavement of people. Yeah. I think that things have really changed. So there's a much broader view of Thoreau. And so, advice to people, let's say, looking at Thoreau is if the different things are going to appeal to different people. And so I think that sometimes we all, start out, everybody reads the economy chapter of Walden, which is pretty tough going. If that's the first thing, I'd actually start with the second chapter of where I lived and what I lived for, I think, right. First. But an economy is wonderful, but there's a lot you have to understand about Thoreau's sense of humor and his allusions to understand what he's talking about. But I would also say that, if you're coming to Concord, just give yourself time to wander around. Like my favorite place is Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, because for me, going there is like seeing a sort of whole community of people that are still there. And I know that sounds funny, but you're in a landscape that actually is that perfect harmony of the natural and man-made. Emerson was actually an advisor to the landscape architects who were developing it, and you're in a place where you not only can talk about all of these writers, and you can talk about how they lived at the same time in the same place, they had the same profession. But there's nothing like actually going to Sleepy Hollow and seeing the graves of, Thoreau and Emerson and Hawthorne and the Alcotts all right, in that same area. And then interspersed with all the other people whose lives were so important to them, whether it's, Mary Merrick Brooks from the Female Anti-Slavery Society, or it's, Judge Hoare, or it's, Damon who owned the mill, or, all the other people. And so you could talk about that for a million years, but the actual impact of going there yourself, and then all of a sudden seeing all those graves together, it somehow knocks it home in a way that you just can't get at any other way.
Exactly. It reminds me of the show Our Town.
Yeah, it does.
Everybody sort of standing by their grave, like they're still there. Yeah, absolutely.
Like Thornton Wilder, right? Comes to Concord, right? And I think the other thing is that everybody goes to Walden, right? Of course, and as we know, Walden is for recreational as well as spiritual and other purposes. So people sometimes get disappointed, but spend time, walk around Walden, spend time there, but also spend time by the rivers. I mean, Robert Thorson, has done so much work on Thoreau and the rivers. He spent actually more time by the rivers and on the rivers and in the rivers, than he actually did at Walden. So, get away from the places where everyone is and spend a little more time looking at the rivers.
I had read his book, The Boatman.
Yeah.
Which goes into how Henry was, measuring the levels of the river and actually working towards actually testifying in court about how the dams going upriver were affecting the farmers downriver.
That's right.
And I spent so much time on that I actually picked up Mark Twain. And I wrote a play, a few years ago called Thoreau and Twain, Brothers on the River, because I realized that Henry was, a child of the river as much as, Walden.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the dams downriver are flooding the meadows the hay meadows upriver, and it's just
It's
just
throwing
a,
off the system.
it's fascinating, and all the different ways. I mean, that he studied the river and all the ways that he related to the rivers. So I guess advice, just kind of get off the beaten track a little bit, and also don't, think about how he related to the things in the center of town. The site of the jail is still there, the home where the Thoreau family lived. His last 2 years, he was at Harvard as part of the Colonial Inn. The Masonic Temple, where the annual gathering usually takes place, is where he first very briefly taught school. I mean, there are so many sites. The town hall where the Lyceum programs were, where John Brown spoke. There's so many sites there that are really important.
Within walking distance of each other, practically.
Absolutely. So I think that's really important. And then think about Concord, think about if you were growing up like Henry Thoreau in a town where you're surrounded of reminders of the American Revolution, which didn't take place in his time, but in his grandparents' time. How does that affect you, that you're growing up in this kind of symbolic town that is already associated?
And I could just imagine all of the older men, that when he was a kid, that had stories that they wanted to tell, and how they were the heroes of the day, and, all sorts of things.
Absolutely. So, and Thoreau is somebody who loved to hear those stories. I mean, he was a great oral historian. He also was a great material culture specialist. I mean, he loved the actual stuff of history. And so when when a barn was being taken down, he went to see, it, so he could see how it had actually been put together. Things like that were really important to him. So you couldn't help but, and just in his daily walk. So you think he passed by all of these sites associated with that first revolution. So in a way, and I grew up in Lexington, right? And I grew up in Lexington, Mass. And then I lived in Concord for almost 50 years, darn near half a century. And you're very well aware of that. And I was aware of, like, when I would go to when I would go to work at the Alcott House, I was passing by Emerson's house every day. I was passing through areas where Thoreau walked. Well, I was always passing through areas where Thoreau walked. And that's another thing. Just get out and walk. And that's for local people or visitors. I'm a great walker, and I found great comfort in the fact that anywhere I ever walked in Concord or nearby, I could come back and look in the journals, and Thoreau had been there. He knew. So all of Concord, was something that was his walking ground. So that's an important part too.
Exactly. I feel like Concord is almost as well documented in, the mid 1800s as like New York is almost any day, right? Like you can always find, somebody was doing something, having dinner with someone, there was a speaker coming. Yeah. So also, but if you're talking about, 50 years ago, were you around during the celebrations of, like, what was it, 1975?
I was.
Centennial.
Yes. Timing is everything. I became director of Orchard House in the late fall of 1974. So in 1975, I was this brand new, in my mid-20s, director of an historic site, and the whole world was coming to Concord, and it was fascinating. It was fascinating because, and talk about the meanings of history and the uses of history, because you had people who associate Concord with protest and standing up to unjust governments. And this is 1975. We're still in the middle of the Vietnam era.
Elise Lemire has just published a fabulous book about 1971. There was a big protest in Lexington and Concord by Vietnam vets who were,
right on the green, and John Kerry. And I've talked to Elise a lot about that. I'm dying to read that book, and I haven't yet, but it's fascinating. And that's where history really echoes, Lexington Green, the symbolic importance of Lexington Green. But what was really interesting, people were protesting the war on Lexington Green in 71. And And the statue that's right at the corner of Lexington Green is of Captain John Parker. We call it the Lexington Minuteman statue, right? But it's really the head of the Lexington militia, the militia company. And his grandson, Captain John Parker's grandson, was Theodore Parker, who was one of the Transcendentalists.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Unitarian minister, one of the Secret Six who was supporting John Brown. And he, talk about the uses of history, he was very aware and proud of the fact that his grandfather had been the leader of the militia on Lexington Green. And of course, Theodore Parker is operating in the 19th century, and he would actually die, I think, in 1860. But he talked about the fact that he was as ready to spring to revolutionary action on behalf of the enslaved as his grandfather was, to fight against oppression by the British monarchy. So
he's also most known for the quote that Martin Luther King Jr. made famous. Yeah. The arc of history always bends towards justice.
And that is Theodore Parker. Yeah. Theodore Parker's quote. So Dr. King picked that up, absolutely, and lived it.
Exactly. And so to get back to the bicentennial whole sense of patriotism and stuff, like how does rebellion fit into patriotism?
Well, exactly. But if you take what does Concord stand for, right? And people there's that spirit of rebellion, there's a spirit of protest and standing up, and there's also the spirit of patriotism and Minuteman missiles, and so you had different groups of people who could make the case, and did, that Concord stood for, or Lexington and Concord stood for particular things, and they could be very opposite things. So it was really quite an interesting time. And President Ford, then Gerald Ford came and spoke. So it was kind of an interesting time period to be in Concord. You go to work, but you also I had like 20 people camping out on my living room floor because everybody wanted to be here.
Of course. So would you say that and this is maybe a question in general, but maybe like at that time or since in your career, have you ever come across any major opposition to anything that you're presenting, or the way that you interpreted something, or I think I read online there was an article printed about the bicentennial where people were just upset that all of these tourists were invading Concord, and horrible it is, and just send all the tourists away, when today it's sort of a major piece of the economy in Concord.
Well, right. And there's always been that interesting tension. And it is a major part of the economy. I've never run into anything in particular. What I've run into a lot are people who want to put words in Thoreau's mouth and say, well, Henry Thoreau would have been for this or against that. And I don't like to do that. I always say, he's dead. He cannot.
He said everything he was going to say. Yeah.
Right. He said everything he's going to say. And therefore, what we can do, he didn't live through the things that we're living through right now, but he asked questions. He asked questions that are absolutely as pertinent as they ever were. So if you want to kind of think about how he might have dealt with things, look at the questions he was asking about the things in his own time. And that, I think, really is to me, the best way to proceed on that, because it's all too easy to say, and people will do that. Well, Thoreau was a pacifist. Well, you can't really say he was a pacifist, that he would have been against the Vietnam War, because we don't know that. Right. And we also know he wasn't a pacifist because look at his support of John Brown. And now that's not me speaking. I might want Thoreau to say I would be, against the Vietnam War, but that's not, you can't do that. You can't force, words into somebody's mouth who has been long dead. So that, I think that's the main thing. And then the other thing is, where people get angry, I found it's really interesting. People get angry with Thoreau because he's forcing them to confront their own lives. Remember that quote I started with, let us consider the way we spend our lives. People get really angry and they'll say, well, I could have been Thoreau if I hadn't gotten married and had a house and, all this. And it's like, well, that's
Right.
kind of the point. Like, let's think about what he's saying about what you have a lot of choices in your life, how you actually want to live your life. And you have a lot more choices than you think you have. And therefore, you are making choices all along. And Thoreau also made very deliberate choices about how he was going to live his life. And he makes us angry because he kind of gets us thinking about our own lives. And maybe we're angry with ourselves or disturbed, or not necessarily living lives of desperation, but are disturbed by some of the compromises maybe we've made. And so therefore he's making us deal with ourselves. And so you get people, I had numerous encounters with people who get just really angry, and then they slide into the usual, like, oh, Thoreau went home and did his laundry, his mother did his laundry and blah, blah. And as Laura Wall says so articulately, he's the only person who ever got in trouble by going home on Sundays and spending Sundays with his family.
Exactly. And what man, in the 1800s did his own laundry anyway?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I think you pointed this out so well before. People tend to want to put people in boxes. They want to encapsulate them in like one sentence, like Louisa May Alcott was like this, and Thoreau was like this, and Emerson was like this. And they're much more complicated. We all are much more complicated than that. So that's what makes me angry, when people try to just be very oversimplistic about things. And
exactly.
Doesn't have a place. Yeah.
Do you, so we've covered some of the main figures in Concord, and I know that you have such amazing details in your head about the more obscure people in Concord, and obscure events and the things that sort of that tourists wouldn't be able to learn even if they generally spent a week in Concord. So do you have any what's sort of one of your favorite things to sort of pull out at a party that says, here's another weird person that lived in Concord that nobody really knows about?
Nobody knows about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who always intrigue me, like Franklin Sanborn, who was one of Brown's supporters, but who obviously had some kind of personality that was pretty off-putting. So he always interests me a lot, because he lived for so long. He lived till 1917. I think, so that, which is pretty amazing. And he got involved not only with Brown, but with the American Social Science Association that really promoted the teaching of social studies in schools. He was involved, with public charities. He was involved as a newspaper editor, just a whole lot of different things. And then he tried to be kind of the interpreter of everyone else's history, which didn't go over well. So he fascinates me. There are a lot of people. I mean, I think we've all been fascinated by the life of Ellen Garrison, from the Robbins family. And the more we learn about her, the more intriguing she is. Grew up and went to school in Concord and ends up, teaching, down south and
formerly enslaved people.
Refusing to take the word of the authorities about a segregated trade depot. So all sorts of interesting people, and I think the point is that their lives are intertwined with everybody else's. So the more we learn about these people, the more we realize those people are so important. The lives of the authors would be so much less rich if those other people didn't exist. So that's what's really neat. And so much of the scholarship has looked at these groups of people, and we tend to just look at individuals, but groups like the Female Anti-Slavery Society and how that worked as a group is, to me, absolutely fascinating. All the work that Sandy Petrolinas did on that, for example, is huge. So I can't pick out one favorite character because it's just so many.
Yeah, no, it's just since you mentioned her, this is one of my favorite books. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And
Yeah, and I was going to say, so one of the ways that I personally was able to start committing to Concord
Mhm.
in a large way was by taking the tour guide class that's
Yes.
offered through the high school. And I took it with Victor Curran, who
Yep.
I think had just taken it over from you. And
Right.
he brought up your
Exactly.
name like every single class. And he's like, I got this from, I stole this, I got this from Jayne Gordon. And like so can you tell me what it was like to try to fit all of that history, the two revolutions, into a class for tour guides
Yeah.
who, like,
Yeah.
I'm still afraid to conduct tours because I know people are going to ask so many questions, and my answer is like, yes, you can look that up when you get home, or I'm
Right.
not sure, or yeah.
Well, I think that's part of it, and I have to say I'm delighted that Victor's teaching that course, because it becomes like your baby, and so when you want to hand it over, you're delighted when there's such a wonderful person to hand it over to. That the course, actually, I taught it for 20 years through Concord Carlisle Adult Ed, and it was never the same 2 years in a row, because I came up with a basic structure, to cover. We never got really beyond 1900. We just we never got there. But each year there would be people in the class who had particular backgrounds and interests, so that would kind of change the composition, or the character of some of the conversations, which I loved. But what's wonderful when you're doing a 6-session plus field trip course is that you can wind things through. You can have threads that wind through, and you're working with the same group of people throughout, and really beginning, and their questions are so good. And I had, in these groups, I had some people who had just moved into Concord, had really no background at all. I had people who lived in Concord their whole lives, a lot of people who worked at the different historic sites. So, and part of that is that, you're instead of feeling, at least for me, and I know for Victor, instead of feeling, kind of daunted by the fact that you've got all these knowledgeable people in the class, it's great because you've got all these people who can share their expertise, which is wonderful. Plus, you're actually in the physical place, so and then you can work on the interpretive side. How do you take actual physical monuments, or sites or landscapes, and use those to make meaning for people? How do you get from the very concrete to the more abstract ideas, and watching people go through that process is wonderful. So I love that course. And when I moved here to Maine, to Damascotta, I had the same questions that we basically, raised throughout the course. I started to apply to my new hometown, and so I've ended up, guess what, teaching courses very similar to that, but in a new place, whole new place, different history, which you wouldn't expect, because it's not that. It's only 3 hours from Concord, but a very different history, and so that's been really fun. Plus, moving to Maine, I'm very much interested in the aspects of Thoreau that relate to his 3 trips to Maine, and so I've been teaching courses about Thoreau. I've been teaching a course on Maine landscape and literature, which has to do with the same thing I've always been interested in, is how taking different Maine writers, how the writers help us to understand the landscape of Maine, and how the landscape helps us to understand the writers' works. So it's taking those same threads and just carrying them through.
Exactly. And I'm so envious. I know that there's a canoe trip that I think happens, in Maine, where they essentially go
Yes.
to the same spots. And one of these years, I'm
I know.
promising myself that
I
I'm
know.
going to take it, because it seems
I
like
know. I've only seen some of those put in places. I am an avid kayaker and canoeer too, but and I've read all about the Wabanaki Trail and all of the wonderful work that has been done, and those expeditions they're fascinating, and not the least of which is the sort of reestablishment of the relationship of the Thoreaus with the Penobscot Nation, which I think is wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Exactly, because I think there are records of Thoreau sort of making friends and identifying Joe Polis as
Yeah,
his
yeah,
guide,
exactly,
right? And
exactly.
I feel like in the society right now, there's sort of this question of, well, he had made notes that we essentially can only call like a bibliography
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
towards like maybe perhaps a book he was writing, or maybe just like his own way to
Right,
sort of see what
right.
is out there in terms of stuff that's already was
So you
written.
can, yeah, you can sort of see his thought process, and you can see his growing, kind of growing sophistication of and cultural understanding, I think. And it's been very interesting to hear the Penobscot perspective on that, because Thoreau starts out being pretty, in his first trip to Maine, kind of asking these questions that are kind of, almost cringeworthy
Right,
sometimes,
right.
and then sometimes really, really good, but trying to really understand a very different culture than the culture that, he was used to in Concord, and then becoming more and more, understanding of that culture. And the more he understood, the more he realized he didn't know, and the more he wanted to research. So it's really an interesting look
Yeah.
at his mind and the way it was working.
Exactly. And when you say cringeworthy, like I don't think there's anything that's sort of like outwardly offensive or intentionally
No, no,
offensive or racist. It's sort of the idea of the noble savage.
it's
And
exactly, yeah,
it's him falling in love with this stereotype, I think, of
it's
what
precisely,
the Americans were at the time. And because there weren't any living in Concord at the
right,
time, that
exactly.
he didn't really have any experience. So that's why his trips to Maine were so significant. So he could actually meet
Absolutely,
people
absolutely.
and sort of,
And you said, he, he was not aware of Native Americans living in Concord. The only ones he saw were people who were coming down, yearly,
traveling
sometimes
through.
sell or not even yearly, but selling baskets and traveling through. Yeah.
Yeah.
So so he's doing the same thing that probably most of us would do, which is, having a fair, that his understanding was pretty simplistic, but so is all of ours. So it's wonderful to see how, the more he had interactions with Native Americans, the more he began to realize that's, as you said, that's stereotype of the sort of Rousseau noble savage, it wasn't holding up. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've had a Nipmuc speaker on our program in the past, and
Right.
there are also other historians who are working very hard
Right.
to correct the like the the stuff around King Philip's War, quote unquote.
Yes.
Like this whole idea that Concord was blessed because the Native Americans just handed over the land, and it was
Yeah.
sort of this lovely interaction,
Yes.
and nobody was killed, and
Right.
the holiday
Right.
Thanksgiving
Come
and all of
come
this.
and save us. Right. Yeah. Kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's even a sign in the center of town. I think it's called Jethro's Tree,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think it was erected in the 1930s,
In the
like
30s,
with
it was.
with the best of intentions, but based on faulty scholarship that happened 80 years
Yeah.
after the fact, of people of like, yeah, so is this how it happened? Is this what
Yes.
was it a
Exactly.
handing over? Was it a trading? Was it whatever?
Right.
And that is sort of like the main historical marker that that represents Native Americans in
Exactly.
Concord at this
Exactly.
point.
And it's so complicated, and not without having the understanding, we can get into the head a little better of the Englishman's understanding, because they've left written records. So how do you get into an understanding when there were not written records? And you need the people who are the Native American historians today to really help us to understand that culture, and what the understanding of land, and the understanding of trade, and the understanding of purchasing 6 acre fair of Musketaquid, what that meant, to the native, Squaw Sachem and the native people. We kind of get a better idea of what it might have meant to the English settlers. And again, I think getting away from that idea that anyone had bad intentions. I don't believe that. I think you just had very different cultures that had very different ways of understanding, and so that's a perfect example of it. And that sign is it's so misleading. Yeah, it is.
Right. And I really feel like we're in a very interesting moment of history
Oh
where
yeah.
a lot of us want just like to figure out what is the, like, to separate like documented fact from legend.
Right.
And
Right.
like the whole idea of people walking around Concord and just, like if you're, not to, take away from anybody who does historical interpretation or who has ever
Right.
done it. But as a child, I remember going around and being led, and people are talking about these legends and the whole patriotism piece, and
Yes.
everybody's wonderful all the time. And
Yeah.
and
Doesn't work.
yeah.
I think one of the most interesting programs I attended, and gosh, I don't even know when it was, maybe 10, 15 years ago, was when the society, it was a group of historians who looked at the interpretation of Minuteman National Park and how that's changed since 1959 when it was established. And they were quite, they were praising the increasing sophistication and complexity of the interpretation. But they were reminding us that when that park was established in 1959, right during the Cold War, you had, the Minutemen, or the colonials, were like the little independent, people looking at the evil empire, which was, are we really talking about the British Empire, or are we talking about the Soviet, are we talking about USSR? Because it's 1959. So, the interpretation told us then more about 1959 than it told us about 1775. And that was really an eye opener for me, because I think about that a lot. And we have our own blind spots. So it's, I don't like trashing the people in the past, and just assuming that they were proceeding from bad intentions. They had their blinders, they had their lack of understanding. And we, people in a couple of decades, or or even less, are going to be looking at us and saying they had these huge gaping holes in their understanding. And obviously we're finding that out more and more. And that it's a continual process, I think.
Yeah. And I think we're also working really hard to address it and try to bring more people into the conversation. So that goes right back into the whole like Thoreau society of like, yes, let's bring you into the fold as long as you have a spirit of inquiry. And if you want to question everything, please do. And help.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at the different people who are questioning from so many different angles, really honestly looking to see how, again, we can live as moral, principled people in this world, and honor our fellow, all our fellow living creatures and the earth. I think that's huge. I think that's huge. So the only thing there isn't room for in the Thoreau Society, I think, are the people who've just sealed themselves off from, from further investigation. And I don't see that. I don't see that in the society. I think there is that honest. And the thing I'm hearing more than anything else now is, there's so much that I don't understand, and I need to learn more. I want to learn more. I want to talk with people, from diverse backgrounds. I want to read more. I want to, and that honest spirit of inquiry, to me, that's very much Henry Thoreau. Exactly. And that's very much Emerson. It's very much all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the main themes that came through to me this year at the annual gathering was about, there were a few sessions on women, reform, and abolition. And, I think maybe even 10 years ago, there wasn't really a knowledge that there was any documentation about this. But now people are uncovering records, and the Concord Library is always like a marvelous source of it's a font of information. So, but I think it's also becoming one of those things that's so relevant that you begin reading about women in the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, and you're like, oh my God, that's that really reminds me of the George Floyd protests that are happening.
Absolutely. And again, that really understanding how a group works, and how and the irony is, of course, the Female Anti-Slavery Society kept like the most amazing records I've been through them. They're incredible. And the way that they worked on a local level, but coordinated with regional, state, national level things, so there doesn't emerge. We always have that wanting to emerge like the one single hero. And I mean, there are the leaders like Mary Merrick Brooks, but it's a lot of different people working together. And I think that's huge. that's huge. And the more we kind of look at some of those group collective actions, the better off we'll be too. So again, if we're seeing ourselves as part of a continuum, but the continuum doesn't just go in one straight line. There are all these layers of the past that we have to look at and honor, and that we're still interacting with the past as well as the present.
Exactly.
And that's huge. And you've captured that very well. And I think the work you've done, it really makes us aware of that, and not in a, weirdo, woo haunted house kind of way, but in a way of just, that the spirits of those people are still with us, in the sense that their voices are still there. We hear those voices. And if they weren't asking the questions and dealing with the, challenges that feel so much like the challenges we're dealing with, we wouldn't care about them, right? I mean, except for a few antiquarian types, nobody would care about these people. They would be dead and over and buried, and we wouldn't even be paying attention. But because they were asking those incredibly pertinent and provocative and perceptive questions, they were, nailing it right in there. And so they have a lot to say that we need to listen to.
Yeah. And I think it's not only their questions, it's the whole fact of the town itself. Like Walden is practically the same, like the center of town is still the same. So there is that element of travel, and there's this longing of wanting to slip into another world, another, where you could just turn a corner and you could run into Henry David Thoreau.
I know.
Yeah.
And again, there's been, and none of that happened by accident. There, every time that something needed to be preserved, there was always a fight and people willing to, to go to the mat for that, for preserving things, and that is important. But there is something about that town, the town of Concord, where you're constantly reminded of other people who have walked there before you, and who have also, had many difficulties and decisions and dilemmas that they were, facing, and so you sort of feel like you're part of that. You're walking not so much in their footsteps, but maybe beside them.
Right. Like it's this very weird interaction, and I find that like I'm as a playwright, I'm always wanting to evoke them and bring them back and give them, a chance to, speak the words that they had written while they were alive, or, involve them in the conversation somehow. And, I always wonder like how they would respond to, like even the Dunkin' Donuts, right? Like there's this whole idea of like chain stores and things. We don't really want them in town, but of course people need their coffee. So like, let's put up a sign, but make sure that it sort of fits in. So it's sort of beige and gray, and it's not the usual
invasive sign, which is kind of an right. Exactly. And I mean, I think that it is an interesting thing too, because if you look at the history of Concord, there was a point at one point where there was a move to actually make it more into a sort of a museum-y village, sort of frozen in time. Right. And what's really fascinating about Concord is it isn't. It's a real place where real people live, not particularly economically diverse, or racially or any other way. So it's not exactly a minuscule portrait of America, but it's a real place. Real people live there, and they have real needs, and so that actually makes it more interesting to people when the teachers come. And this is always fascinating, because I have teachers literally coming from all over the country, and they're staying at the Colonial Inn. They're spending a week right in Concord, and it's fascinating to see their reactions to the town. They love it. I mean, it's a kind of mythical place to them, but throughout the week they're living there, and they're seeing the traffic jams, and they're the high prices and everything else. Yeah. But that's all part of. I mean, that is Concord, and interesting. I remember a couple of years ago we were walking up Main Street towards Thoreau's house, and the house next to it had a huge Black Lives Matter sign. It was great. That juxtaposition of past and present was just perfect. And I think that's what makes it feel so lively and alive to people.
Exactly. And like also like such a unique place, because it's not like a Plymouth plantation. It's not a living history museum town. It's, like tourists are welcome, but there are other people here too. And like a lot of the poor people who visit are like academics who dream of moving there, or
Right.
retiring there. And you're right, like there isn't housing for people who, who don't have a certain, who live below a certain level of means, because
Right.
a lot of the houses are grand and very
Yeah.
fancy and
Yeah. Yeah.
huge and sit on large pieces of property. It's a very,
Exactly. And it actually has become a little less, diverse and slightly less colorful, I think, over time, because, the property prices have gone up so much that it does, it's a barrier to a lot of people. But even though they can't live there, they can certainly be welcome there, right? And feel like, for however long they're there, that they're part of that community, and that's really important. And it does have that nice kind of small town feeling, of for people, and people who are dealing with people coming in, visitors from all over, are very welcoming. That's a great, nice public face, for the town, I think, to the world.
And I definitely feel that small town vibe when it comes to like the Thoreau Society and even the Orchard House. And, anytime you visit one of the historical locations, it's sort of like this insider sense of like, oh, you're here to learn more about history. You're here to be, like you were saying, in the actual place to learn what it's like to walk in. Exactly. Yeah. Like, oh, okay. Like, we get you. Yes. Come on in.
Come on in. You're one of us. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And so, and I think that's what's wonderful. I mean, again, that sort of intimacy, the very personal, relationships that the people at the sites have with visitors, that the kind of conversations that go on are wonderful. And, there's not, these places don't have a set script. So it'll really allow, I mean, they have obviously a framework of what topics they're going to cover and what major themes, but within that gives people a lot of room for conversations that meet the visitors' interests as well, and help them to understand what it is that they're seeing and that they're walking through.
Yeah. Because are you coming here for a book report? Are you coming here because you want to be a reenactor in, the 1775, the April 19th events or something? Like,
exactly.
Why are you here? Yeah.
Exactly. All these pilgrims coming from.
It's the pilgrims. Yeah, like they're not just tourists. Like there are tourists who are there because, oh, it's a nice day trip from Boston and it's easy to do. But there are pilgrims.
There are pilgrims, and they're not just like bucket list things. These are people who, who've often waited, many years to finally come to this place, and it's really, really special to them. And so it's a question of, honoring that, and working with that, and understanding that for them, that experience, it isn't just checking off, your bucket list of top places to see. So I think that's huge. And I think that the annual gathering is really something that displays the best of that. I love that. I mean, the annual gathering is not like, there's nothing svelte about the place where we gather, the Masonic Temple. We're hot. We're in shorts and t-shirts.
No air conditioning. Yeah, everybody gets really casual really quick. Yeah.
The longer you've been there, the more you know exactly where to sit, where the little breeze will actually hit you. But there's something that there's something about that makes it's like going to camp or something. I think it just makes you feel more informal, and we're all in this together. So there's a part of me that would never want that, to change, to have, if we were in a very modern, perfectly air-conditioned conference facility. Exactly. I don't know it would have the same feeling, so there's nothing like sweating to death in the Masonic Temple and then having a beer on the porch of the Colonial Inn. To me, is a great, with great conversation that goes on for hours. That to me is what I want.
Exactly. So yes, I kind of want to leave on that image, but I have one last question for you.
Sure.
If you had a magic wand and they discovered a trunk of papers, that was something that you had always wanted to read. You opened up that trunk. What would be in there?
Wow, what would be in it? I guess because of my fascination with the Robbins family, I'd want it to be something from I probably want it to be something from either Susan Robbins or Ellen Garrison that helped me to understand even more, what their lives were like. That would be, to me, the magic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's such a great answer. Yes. And thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done at the annual gathering for, and helping everybody, just like your lifetime of education and really reaching out to everybody. And thank you very much for appearing with us here on Concord Days.
My pleasure.